what are the top 10 starts to an NBA season in NBA history? And where do these 2024 Cavaliers rank among them? At number 10, we have the 1997 Los Angeles Lakers going 11-0. This squad had a young 19-year-old Kobe Bryant and a prime Shaquille O'Neal who was fresh out of Orlando looking to establish himself in the Western Conference. And this team also had Laker legends such as Eddie Jones and Nick Van Exel. If you're a Lakers fan, you remember these guys. Or if you're an old man like I am. During this span, Shaq averaged 26 points per game with 11 rebounds. Kazam! And as we were still about a year away from Kobe entering the starting lineup, Eddie Jones was the number 2 on this team. During this span, he averaged 18 points per game, but it was his defense that really set him apart. Eddie Jones and Shaquille O'Neal was actually a great preview for what we had with Kobe and Shaq. And can we pause and talk about how cold this picture really is? 3 young men on top of the world living out their dream, their passion is their career. It really doesn't get much better than that. This Lakers team would finish 61-21, but unfortunately was swept by the Utah Jazz in the Western Conference Finals, who would then go on to lose to the Chicago Bulls. Editor's note here, this series is actually a major testament to how good this Jazz team really was. They swept a 60-win team in the Western Conference Finals, then almost took these Bulls to 7 games. At number 9, we have the 1972 Boston Celtics, who started off 12-0. This was a Celtics team that was still learning to win without Bill Russell. And at this point in history, Bill Russell was pretty much without a doubt the GOAT. This team was led by players like John Havlicek, who averaged 27 points per game during this streak, and David Cohens, who would actually end up winning MVP that year. Many would say don't forget JoJo White. This really was a great team. They just weren't the same powerhouse they were after Russell had left. They would end up finishing 68-14, but lose in the Eastern Conference Finals to the eventual champions, New York Knicks. Drink your water. Hit that sub button. At number 8, we have the 1996 Houston Rockets, who also started off 12-0. This Rockets team was already loaded with players like Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler. So when they added Charles Barkley, this team had a title or bust mentality. Even with their old age, they were still regarded as some of the best players in the league. And looking back throughout history, this is also one of the earliest big threes the NBA really ever saw. And this 12-0 start heavily supported that idea, as Charles Barkley would average a whopping 14 rebounds per game and would be a perfect complement to both Hakeem and Clyde. This team had 8 players over the age of 30, and unfortunately that would prove to be a major issue for them. Had it not been for injuries, this team may have ended up going to the finals to play the Chicago Bulls, but they ended up losing in the Western Conference Finals to the Utah Jazz, who would then go on to lose to the Chicago Bulls again. And at number 7, we have the same team the Jazz just lost to in the 1996 Bulls. This team was fresh off setting the record for the best record in NBA history at 72-10. So when this team started off 12-0, it really showed that they were still in the same mentality. The league was absolutely put on notice. Their narrative here was pretty straightforward. Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, all playing at their peaks, with Phil Jackson leading the way. But of course, as this team was getting up there in age, they had to overcome a few injuries, and had it not been for that, they may have ended up breaking their own record as they finished 69-13. Ironically, the team to end this streak would be the Utah Jazz, but they would end up getting their payback in the NBA Finals. At number 6, we have the 1982 Philadelphia 76ers, who started off 13-0. These 76ers were already a powerhouse with both Julius Erving and Maurice Cheeks, and once they added MVP Moses Malone, they took their championship window and quite literally kicked the door in. During this stretch, Moses Malone would average 25 points and 15 rebounds. And as a team, they ranked second defensively, and with 4 different players scoring over 15 points per game, this team was near unbeatable as they finished the season 65-17. And if you know NBA history, you've heard of faux, and this was said by Moses Malone, who famously predicted they would go undefeated en route to get their championship. And he was nearly correct. They would go 12-1 en route to winning a ring and being one of the greatest teams in NBA history, and quite possibly the very first Big Three. The number 5 team on this list is the 1957 Boston Celtics, who started 14-0. Bill Russell was not quite the legend or champion that we know of him as today. Bob Cousy was still widely considered to be one of the greatest Celtics of all time, the leader of that team, and was a major part of this team's success. And this Celtics squad, they were looking to repeat as champions as they won in 1956. But little do they know it, they were also laying the groundwork for the dynasty that we know of in the 1960s. Unfortunately, this season, Bill Russell got injured in Game 3 of the finals and missed the rest of the series, and the Celtics ended up losing to the St. Louis Hawks. But again, as I said, Celtics fans would not have to suffer for very long, as they would go on to win the next 11 of 13 titles. And number 4 brings us to the 2002 Dallas Mavericks, starting 14-0. This one was pretty straightforward. Dirk Nowitzki and Steve Nash were absolutely insane together. And with players like Michael Finley, Sean Bradley, and Raja Bell to hold down the defense, this team was extremely deep. In an era where scoring was much more difficult than it is today, the Mavericks averaged 104 points, but more importantly, had the 6th ranked defense to make them so balanced. balanced. A common trend in most of these teams is that they were anchored by a strong defense with assets to explode on offense. And this specific Dallas team would end up going to finish number 1 in the league. They finished 60-22, but end up losing in the Western Conference Finals to the Spurs. And this actually leads us right into a very interesting anecdote into Mavericks history. It was in these 2003 Western Conference Finals that Dirk Nowitzki suffered an injury that took him out in the second quarter of Game 2. So head coach at the time, Don Nelson, decided to sit out Dirk for the remainder of the playoffs. He figured it wasn't worth risking his entire career over one playoff series. But Nelson's decision was controversial. Mavericks owner Mark Cuban argued that Nowitzki should have played. He claimed that team doctors assured that Dirk would not get injured any further. Nelson again did not budge. He said he did not want to risk all of Nowitzki's career over a single game. And later, Don Nelson would say that this decision pretty much destroyed his relationship with Mark Cuban. For number 3, we're going way back in the time machine, back to 1948 in the Washington Capitals. And no, I do not mean the hockey team, I mean the basketball team that belonged to the Basketball Association of America, the BAA. And even though you have no idea what I'm talking about, this team started 15-0. There's only one thing that needs to be said when it comes to this team: Red Auerbach. And if that rings a bell, then it should, because that was the coach of that Celtics dynasty in the 1960s, and quite possibly one of the greatest coaches in NBA or even sports history. Editor's note here: as I was going through these pictures, it just made me think that Red Auerbach and Bill Russell must have had some of the craziest of times together, celebrating 11 championships. They must have done some wild things together. Alright, back to the video. Hit that sub button. This team finished 38-22, but ended up losing to the Minneapolis Lakers in the finals. And yes, that is the team that would eventually become the Los Angeles Lakers. And something tells me this loss made all his victories in the 1960s over those Lakers even more sweet. And at number 2, we have the 1993 Houston Rockets, who started 15-0. After year after year after year of playoff disappointment, the Rockets were ready to burst out the gate and really set the tone for this championship season. In fact, this would be one of the greatest individual seasons for a player in NBA history, as Hakeem would go on to win MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, and Finals MVP. The list of players to do that is very short. This team would go on to finish 50-24 and win the title against the New York Knicks in the NBA Finals. Let's just drink your water. And finally, at number 1, we have the 2015 Golden State Warriors, who started 24-0. This squad was riding the high off their first championship in the Steph Curry era, and they were out to prove their dominance was absolutely no fluke. During that stretch, Curry would average 32 points per game and shoot 45% from 3, as he would go on to win the first unanimous MVP in history, and the Warriors were going to beat the Bulls record for the best record in NBA history at 73-9. But it don't mean a thing without the ring. Unfortunately, as most of you watching right now already know, this team are going to lose a 3-1 lead to the Cleveland Cavaliers in those finals. As of November 18th, the Cavaliers are 15-0, which is good enough for the 3rd best start in NBA history, which isn't including those 1948 Capitals. I'm glad to see you're paying attention, and we'll just have to see how far they can go and where they'll end up ranking all time. And which record do you think is most impressive or means the most to NBA history? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, think about watching either of these videos that's on the screen. As always, hit that sub button and turn on notifications. Go out there and do something great.